Hey, Michael, Steve, alrighty. My days do not get slow. My goodness. I'm trying to fit this in. There's so many things keep popping up. Okay, I'm going to throw a timer up for me. Not a timer, a stopwatch, let's say. I'm going to start that and I'm going to shoot for half an hour. Again, my big concern here is that I've done too much. So I'm going to go a little quick, but I think given that we have time to chat with the group afterwards, that I may be a little brisker in my presentation style than normal, but who goes? I'll try to model that now and see what you think. Alrighty, I'm starting now. Good. Alrighty, so thank you all for inviting me here today. I really look forward to chatting with you all and especially with the back and forth we're going to have afterwards. But I'm going to start by just kind of setting the stage with this presentation. So I know the real focus of the presentation is to try to give you some sense about how you can support faculty as they deal with this, what I call forced migration online. I'm mostly going to be talking about what makes an online course good. And then we'll sneak in every now and then recommendations about, the role you could play in helping professors mount those sorts of courses. Okay, very quickly, by the way, I'm Steve Jordan's. I stole this from 680 News. I'll go over it, but they did a good graphic, so I stole it. So just quickly mention, I've done a lot of online teaching myself, both, on campus. The course I teach is 1,700 students large, uses a lot of ed tech. I've just noticed a typo in psychology. I'll create that. And also I've got a couple of courses on Coursera, one with over 250,000 students, and another relatively new one that I launched just to help students manage anxiety during COVID, and it's got like 75,000 students in 8 weeks. So I'm used to the online world. I'm used to teaching at scale. I also incorporate this as my research. So I'm a director of the Advanced Learning Technologies Lab. And so within that lab, students create and assess educational technologies for efficacy and usability. Because I use these technologies so much, I want to use the best ones, and if the best ones don't exist, we want to build them. And so we do that. And this has also resulted, by the way, in us having a startup called Cognito for some of the technologies that we have built. Pure Scholar perhaps being the largest one. I'll mention that later today. But for now, let me just say, I kind of live in this EdTech online world quite a bit, so it's really fun to get to talk to all you guys about that today. All right. So let's get sort of to the point. What makes an online learning experience rock? I'm going to highlight 4 things for now, so let's just talk about them. Students see the course as interesting and find it easy to remain engaged. That's what these are our goals as an instructor, right? Students think about the course even when they're not directly engaged, because get rid of that, and because its relevance is clear. So if there's relevance to the personal life, then the person runs into the relevance of the course as they live their life. That's what we would really like to have, that keep kind of coming back to mind. We'd also hope that within our course, students are given practice using skills like critical thought, creative thought, and communication. You only develop skills through practice, as I will highlight in a second. And finally, we would like to think that they feel the assessments are fair and reflect their learning, while also potentially deepening their learning. I won't be talking too much about assessment today. Suffice it to say, though, I do think about it quite a bit, and while students are being assessed, their mind is really engaged. So it's a great time to do some learning as well, but that's kind of another story. I won't focus on that one too much. I do want to focus for a moment on this issue of skills, because I want to make something clear before we jump into the formal part of the presentation. And that is this distinction between learning knowledge and learning skills. So I say things like you can learn a great deal about guitar playing in a 1-hour lecture, but if you want to play guitar, that requires a very different learning process. You're not going to learn to play guitar in an hour, and you're not going to learn it by having somebody just speak to you. You only learn to play guitar by playing guitar. Badly at first, but with enough repeated structured practice and enough feedback, your skill gets better and better and better. That's how skills develop. So it's a challenge. Developing skills is a real challenge in a lot of learning contexts. But the key is to try to give students that practice and to formalize that practice as much as possible. This is something I care about quite a bit, so it's going to sneak through the talk. a little bit. Okay, so what are we going to do today? So some basic background, that's what I just gave you, right? So we can check that off. Check. But then from here, we're going to first, I will highlight what I consider the three kind of components if we were going to consider an online learning experience and kind of cut it in thirds. Here's how we could do it. And then, well, I said tips for optimizing learning for each component. I'm going to focus very heavily on one, touch on the other one a little bit, and barely talk about the third. But within each, we will get some tips. And I've focused on the ones that I think are areas where you guys could have the maximum impact. And so that will be part of what I do too, is thoughts on how that optimization can be supported by you. Okay, so let's jump into the three components. The first, and the one I'm going to spend most of the time on, is course content. I mean, ultimately, teaching is still about teaching well. Online teaching is different. And in some ways, the bar is higher because the challenge is higher. I'll get to that. But this is if you do this well as an instructor, if you can really present your content in a way students find engaging and they think you're there, you're going most of the distance here. This is what I'm not going to talk about too much. Assessments, final exams. I have some thoughts on that. I'll touch on it really quickly at the end, but that'll be more for discussion if you want. The other one that I will talk about in a little more detail, though, are the activities you do throughout the course, right? So you have the lectures, but then usually you ask students to do some assignments. I like the word activity because it should be active learning. And these activities ask students to work with the information. And if you do it right, they are also asking students to practice these skills, the critical thought, the creative thought, etc. And so that's really the really critical role that these activities play. This is where you can get the skills practice. This is where you get the information, okay? And this is where you see how much of it's stuck. So I'm more excited about these two. And those are the two I'll be focusing on. So let's jump in. Let's talk about the content itself. So engaging students during content delivery. This is the great challenge. I mean, it truly is. There's no other way to talk about it. It is a real challenge for online educators. And if they meet it half-heartedly, they will fail. So let's start by appreciating the challenge. So a little multiple choice question for you. And I'm just curious. So which of the following is true of you? A, you registered for one or more online courses but never really watched a class. B, registered for one or more online courses, watched a bit, then stopped. C, registered for one or more online courses, watched most of it, then stopped. D, registered for one or more online courses and completed it. E, never registered for an online course. So please answer. Let's see what you do. And Michael, my expectation is we will see quite a few A's and B's in this course, and that's what I'm kind of hoping for. This idea of somebody registering for a course but never really following through with it. I've certainly done that twice myself. Okay, so let me show you a couple of my online courses. This is the one I've created most recently, and I would consider it pretty relevant in the sense that I created it specifically because I knew how many people were anxious over COVID-19. And at the time I created this talk, 79,000 learners had taken my course, had registered, I should say, for my course. And so this is the real question. Of these 79,000 who register, or actually let's use the 77 because I don't know what happened to the other two, but they say eligible here. So of these 77,000, only 23,000 completed. In fact, you can kind of see here how they're completing, and there's just really 4 steps here. Don't worry too much about this data point. This is a certificate thing. So, but 30% almost completed the whole course. This is actually a really high number, as I'll show you in a moment. But this is people who intentionally chose to register for a course that they thought was helpful in their life at a time when they're feeling a bunch of anxiety, and this is going to help them. And even then, only 30% actually stick with the course. The other course I have is an intro psych course. 231,000 people in this funnel, and look at the rates though. What happens after only a few modules? We're down and it continues to drop. Students have a real problem staying engaged with the course, continuing to watch those lectures. That's the challenge. And, they say know your enemy. Well, this is your enemy. Okay, when you have a student sitting on a computer, doing their work, they're learning on a computer, they are simultaneously sitting in front of the biggest distraction machine they've ever experienced in their life. And they probably have their phone right beside them while they do, just to double up on the distraction. And so while you're lecturing, tweets are coming in, Facebook posts are happening. That just shows how old I am, right? Because I'm not using the new app kind of names, but whatever. Their attention is constantly being pulled 5 different directions. It's not that they have a short attention span. It's that they're in a world that's constantly trying to grab their attention. And if you want it, you got to fight with these guys. Okay. And so how do you fight with these guys? How do you get the students' attention? A few tricks. So first of all, we've done some research. This is just accepted for publication. Really looking at this online learning experience and looking at the various factors that play a role. Happy to share this with you if you would like. But I'm just going to highlight for this talk that the number one factor in online courses and students' perception about how good they were is something we call instructor presence. I like to say to instructors, you have to be there and you have to care. To be there and care. So they're most happy when they're in a course where the professor feels like they're present. Their voice is there. They're showing videos that when something happens in the course, they show that they're learning along with the students and reacting, and that they care for the learning of the student. That's step one. The professor has to have that attitude. Now, every professor would say, well, of course, I have that attitude for every course. Yes, but there's presence and there's presence, and we want to optimize presence. I'm going to leave this one sitting on the table and come back to it because I think presence is sometimes the result of other things we do, that it results in presence. So let me hold that, but just know, that is the number one factor. If that professor is good, let's just say good, the students are going to like that course a lot better. And I think we can make professors gooder. Take that. I did that on purpose. Okay, so let's look at other factors and come back to this in a second. So this is a publication I have. Let's riff off Riffs. So this was the question was, how can we engage students in online material? And in this article, I highlight the importance of this acronym I call Riffs, which stands for make the lecture relevant and or interesting and or funny and or social. Make the learning experience, I should say, relevant, interesting, fun, or social. That these are the things that grab the mind. When a student sees relevance, when they're interested, and you can build interest. For example, you can begin a lecture by asking some question about what'll happen in a given situation, especially if it's very counterintuitive, and you can have students answer that question. And if a bunch of them are wrong, you can just say, no, that's not right. But I'm not going to tell you what the right answer is. I'm going to ask you again at the end of the lecture, and I think you'll know the right answer then. You've now engaged curiosity. Students wanting to know what the right answer is, and that's a way of leveraging interest. So you can craft these things, and if you're thinking about this while you're writing your lecture, why would students find this point I'm making interesting or relevant? Oh, they should because of X. Well, say X. Hit that X. Fun, by the way, let me mention. Positive emotional states allow more blood to flow to the frontal lobes. So if an experience is threatening or scary, students have less blood in their frontal lobes. If it's embracing and fun and enjoyable, they have more blood in their frontal lobes. You want the latter. So if you can bring a little bit of fun in, cool, fantastic. You see, I try to make fun of myself. That's the best. You can always make fun of yourself. Anything like that. Social, let me hold off social. Social is harder to do in a lecture, because it's mostly you talking, right? And especially when it's asynchronously, you've recorded this lecture. And so it's harder to be social there, but I think you can be social in other places, as I'll highlight. Okay, so yeah, relevant, interesting, fun, social. Keep those things in mind when you create your lectures, and make sure you're doing your best to kind of emphasize these things as they go, because if the students see it, then they'll be more engaged. we used to give long, boring lectures. And we did it because we had the room, and we had the room for 2 hours a week. So if you have the room for 2 hours a week, you better give a 2-hour lecture. And so people have given 50-minute, 90-minute, or gasp, more than that, lectures. There is no reason. We know this doesn't work. We've been doing breaks. We've been doing all sorts of things to try to give students help. And by the way, this is an example where people will pick on online learning and talk about the deficiencies. There's a lot of deficiencies in traditional learning as well. And this is one of them. We should never have such long lectures. Rather, you should have smaller lectures, 5 to 25 minutes. Take that 50-minute lecture and turn it into 2 or 3 lectures. Take that 90-minute lecture and turn it into 6 lectures that are 15 minutes each. Try to keep it a little compact. This isn't because young people these days can't pay attention. No, it's because you should really only try to say 1 or 2 things and then let them stew on it. So if you're saying 1, 2, okay, maybe 3 things, maybe 4 ideas, that's the most a student can take in and kind of consider and chew on it. And once you start adding too much to it, the previous stuff you've talked about just gets pushed out of their mind. So better to give them a chunk of the material and let them stew on it a bit. Make it separate, smaller chunks. Each of these chunks should stand on their own. It should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It should be a story, a sense of a story where it kind of moves somewhere, as stories do. You introduce relevant characters, you get something going on between these characters, and you get some event happen, and you get some resolution at the end. While you're telling the story, you should emphasize relevance, interest, or fun, as you do. So you end up with a bunch of shorter little stories that a student can sit and watch and then go away from with that whole story still in mind and think about it a little bit. And then they can come back to the next story and they can connect that next story to what they're doing. Okay. Also, by the way, at the end of everything, you should re-emphasize the critical points. And you can do that in a couple of ways, as I'll tell you. So let's take the storytelling thing for a second. Why am I saying storytelling?
Why do stories work? There's a nature and a nurture argument. On the nurture side, we're raised on stories, bedtime stories, fairy tales, fables, cartoons, and we're immersed in them all of our lives, courtesy of the vast entertainment and media.
Now, I'm not going to show this all now, Michael, but it goes on for another 2 minutes, so I may have to add 2 minutes to the end. But I don't know if you can even get the audio of this when I transmit through. So the important point is not so much this guy telling the story about stories. It's a little bit, but this is also an example of how we use pattern interrupts. So if I'm sort of back on script here, so there's 2 points to this slide. One point is, yes, telling stories is a very powerful way. People can remember it better, they can think about it better. So having that story in there is great. But every now and then, as you're telling that story, even though it's only 15 or 20 minutes, you still want to change things up now and then. My marketer friends call these pattern interrupts, and they claim they want them to happen every 30 seconds. But they're thinking, of course, of a commercial on television where you got to change things up pretty regularly if you want people to keep engaging. The same thing is true of lecturing on a sort of larger level. Don't just keep doing the same thing. You've already noticed my slides are changing quite a bit, but I will do things like incorporate a little bit of video or go to a website to connect with an animation or, run some little thing, do a little experiment, do a poll, do questions, scatter those in a little bit to interrupt the flow and change it up. And that every time you do that, it brings people's attention back. So these pattern interrupts are very critical as well. Okay. So here's a little assessment. Now, by the way, this is another tool you can use. As you're teaching, every now and then throw one of these out to the students. It's kind of letting them know, hey, I was paying attention. So for example, what are some of the tools you can use to foster engagement from what we've just talked about? Shorten lectures into tighter stories. Do whatever possible to make lectures relevant, interesting, fun, or social. Use pattern interrupts. Use embedded assessments as learning checks, rewards. So I just added this one because it is the slide. But the answer is all of the above. These are things you can do that make the lecture kind of move along, keep the person engaged in the story, let them see the relevance, pull their attention back regularly with pattern interrupts, and then use an assessment like this to make them go, yeah, I got all that. And these can seem silly, right? You're just asking them what you just told them. Yeah, but when you're the learner and you just know the right answer, it just sort of ties it up for you. You're like, yeah, okay, cool. I knew all that. Very cool. All right. So those are some of my tips about how to make the actual content delivery more engaging. Sorry. So what can you do as a company to try to support faculty while they're doing this? So here's just one example I throw out there, one thought I had. I don't want to talk too much about your worlds because you know your worlds better than I do. But what I would imagine is you could maybe create a short set of lectures where you kind of find really good professors and maybe even teach them a little bit about some of these techniques and ask them to create 15-minute lectures or 10-minute lectures on just some topic maybe everybody cares about, or maybe not. Maybe get them to do some boring topic, but have them use all of these things I've talked about. And then have that 10-minute thing as a sort of standalone, but also have an analysis of that 10-minute thing, talking about how the instructor crafted, and I'm going to use this term quite a bit, crafted the lecture by intentionally incorporating these components so people can watch the lecture and decide for themselves whether they think it's more or less engaging than their work. And then if they think, yeah, that person's got some mojo, they can look at the mojo. They can basically say, well, here it is, and you can have it too. Okay. Now, this will bring it back. This is a way of sort of teaching other instructors what those components are and making it explicit to them. And I think there's something really important that happens when professors start to feel like they are crafting something. I think so often they feel like they're just downloading. Well, I'm just telling students, and the point I'm kind of making is, hey, there's the information you're telling them, but then there's the way you present it. That's where the crafting comes in. And there are things, a small set of relatively simple tricks you can learn to craft better. And once somebody starts feeling like they are crafting a lecture, they start to feel proud of what they're creating. We all feel proud of our creations. And once you start to feel proud of your course that you're created, you connect with it more closely. And when students start going through it, you care more about their experience, whether they're enjoying it as much as you think, etc. So when you can get an instructor to become a craftsman, then that begets pride, and pride begets presence. So remember when I talked about presence, how important it was? I think the source of presence is a real pride in what you've created and a desire to share it with others and impact others positively from it. And so I think we can build presence indirectly. Okay. So let me shift gears here. That was the online presentation of the content. Let me now talk about activities. And again, you might be more familiar with the term assignments. I don't like assignments because assignments sound like a job. An activity is something that you're going to now become active, right? You're not just going to sit there and passively get information out. We're going to want you to do something. And while you're doing something, you're going to engage skills like critical thought, etc. And that's part of what we want activities to do. In fact, if I talk about the optimal online activities, first of all, they're typically worth some grades because, like it or not, that's one way to get students plugged in, right? So they'll do it for the grades. It's not the optimal way. We want to use interest and relevance and all of those things because they're much more intrinsic. They're much more real forms of engagement. But marks will help, if nothing else. You want to try to ask students to do some work in the context of what they're learning, whatever that course is, but you want to try to consider that work as an opportunity to exercise their core skills of success. Critical thinking, creative thinking, clear communication, collaboration. If you can work any of these into the activity, then that's fantastic. And the more explicitly you can do that, the more formally, fantastic. And I'm going to show you some thoughts on that. once the student does work with their learning, they should ultimately understand the material better. So it's not just this is like that was the information and this is the skills. No, working with the information gets you a much deeper understanding of that information too. So these activities aren't only about skills, they are about further deepening the student's understanding of at least some of the knowledge they've been interacting with. And optimally, students are allowed to interact with other students and maybe even think or create together in some way. So, online learning feels so impersonal, right? Because it's you and a computer. We don't want that. We want students to feel like they're part of a class and part of an activity, and the activity is the place we can do that. Okay, so let me try to be a little more concrete. Now, here's a problem with activities. There's lots of them, and they're very different styles, and many different ways of coming at things are good. So it's hard for me to say this is the right way, although I actually think there's a best way that should be used very widely. And I will highlight that. But I do want to be clear, this is just one of, it's up to the creativity of the instructor of how to ask students to do something that does this. But I'm going to give you an example to try to be clear about what I mean about what an optimal activity would look like. And then again, maybe how you can support that. So this is an example from my current course, History of Psychology. Just to give you a sense of the playfulness and some of the fun, the interesting, all of that Riffs stuff applies here, as I'll highlight in a second. But I picked 12 famous psychologists over here on the right. Not the most famous perhaps, but at least a close second string, if you will. And I say to them, hey, pretend you have the opportunity to play one of these psychologists. You can pick which one in an upcoming film. So they pick a psychologist. Somebody says, I want to be Elizabeth Loftus in this film. So they start by learning everything there is to learn about Elizabeth Loftus. And then I say, okay, now you're going to have to audition for this role. And so for this audition, we want to see you play this psychologist. We want you to show us you understand the psychologist by you creating a short interview between the psychologist and a reporter. And we're going to pretend the psychologist is living now with us, and COVID is happening, and this character will provide his or her perspective on some issue related to COVID-19. Okay, and so you're going to have to craft this. And then I like to say to them, hey, the interview can be written out, or it can be a video that you create with a friend interviewing you, or it can be a social media post. I say interview, even that's not critical. It's you playing this person talking about COVID-19, some issue of COVID-19 that you think this person would find interesting. Okay, you get the sense. The idea here, though, is I'm trying to make this interesting. I'm trying to make it relevant. It certainly is social, as you'll see in a moment, but I'll get to that. But for now, relevant, interesting, and maybe even a little fun, right? Playing this thing. So the riffs strike again. What makes a lecture engaging also makes an activity engaging. So you should be thinking about those same attributes when you think of activities. Okay, so then the question is, how do you deliver this activity? And this is where I want to show you the potential. This is more where I hope online learning will go. In the traditional mode, the person would create their composition, their interview, whatever it is. They would send it in, and it would ultimately go to a professor, and it would be graded and eventually come back. I've created something called Peer Scholar that manages a different process. And the process works as follows. It's called formative peer assessment. Yes, they create that original one, but then they enter into a phase where they see what some of their fellow peers created, anonymously presented, randomly selected. So maybe they see what 6 of their peers, the interview of 6 of their peers, and we say, you are now the teacher. We want you to watch each of these and give good positive feedback to each. What did they do well? But also some constructive feedback about how could they improve their work? What could they fix that would make their work even better? So this is requiring students to think critically, to think creatively about how it can be better, to communicate that all to the peer, and then to do it for the next peer, next peer, next peer. So we have peer interaction going on, we have communication, we have critical thinking, we have, creative thinking, etc. Now, as a student is, say, assessing 6 peers are also assessing them. So in the next step, they get feedback from 6 of their peers. And now we're going to focus on, hey, we're going to teach you how to learn from the feedback. Again, critical analysis of the feedback, creatively thinking about what that person suggests, reflecting on all that, and then using it to actually revise your work. Doing that for the first peer, and then the second and the third, getting repeated structured practice using these skills to ultimately produce a revised work, which then the professor sees. Okay? The really cool thing about a process like this is they get all this repeated structured practice with skill development here, and it's all powered by the students. This is all driven, totally by the students. So this is the kind of thing I think is really exciting. But your average professor is not just going to go running to a edtech tool like this. Pedagogically, it's a little beyond the way many average professors think. When they hear about this, they love all this stuff, but they wouldn't naturally land here, probably. And so, the question is, how can we make these kinds of rich activities, because this is where the students interact with each other and such, how can we make those more common? I just wanted to say, by the way, the peer scholar thing that I use to do that, and this process itself, I've done a lot of research on. It's scalable to any level. You can actually measure skills as well as developing them, and it builds a sense of community in large or online classes. So it's a very powerful thing for both skill building and community building, which I think is the role that the activities play in an online course, very heavily. What can you do to help this sort of activity to become more dominant? What I would suggest is almost similar to what I suggested, a little differently, but I can imagine that for some of your titles, you could, in fact, design the activity with the author, or somebody with pedagogical expertise could work with the author and say, how about we produce an activity that we embed in a technology that's already easy to go, and that all the instructor really needs to do is set some dates and run with it. Or, okay, so let's say that. So the first time an instructor maybe adopts one of your textbooks, and it comes with this platform where they can run an activity that's going to do all of this stuff, and they don't have to think about it too much. They can basically set the dates and run. But what I think you should also do is gather feedback from students. As at the end of the activity, it should ask the students their impressions of things, and you should reflect that feedback back to the instructor. That will build the craftsman in them. That will start thinking, and then they can tweak, right? So they come with this pre-authored activity, that it's the authoring of the activity that's sometimes very challenging to them. So somebody's already done that hard work, but now that they see it and they've used it, now they're probably quite able to tweak it and make it their activity, right? It's a much easier road for them to go, to start with something and then tweak. And again, as the comfort with that solution grows, so will craftsmanship. They'll start to craft more. Again, craftsmanship begets pride. Pride begets activity presence. So activity presence is how present are you while students are going through this activity? Are you scaffolding it? Are you giving them suggestions? Are you plugged in? Are you there and care? We need to be there and care for the content side, but we also need to be there and care for the activity side. So again, more building of presence. I'm already slightly over time, I see, David, but that's cool. This is the last part. I'm not going to talk about it unless you guys want to. I have a lot of thoughts. This is our technology for online learning. So I just throw it there quickly. But let me just say, final exams and high stakes assessments are a challenge right now. And there's especially a challenge around academic integrity, confirming that the student writing the exam is the student you think they are, and that they're writing the exam without looking at just about everything else possible. This is a major challenge. We can talk about that more, but it's a very different challenge, I think. And so I think for my expertise, it was those first two areas that I decided to speak to most specifically. So that is it for my talk as I have it now. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions as we go through. Cool. So I'm at 33:30, which isn't as bad as I thought, Michael. I thought it could be worse than that. So I may look for a place to cut a little bit, but I look forward to any of your thoughts or suggestions about, is there a place you think I could cut? Is there something that was especially important, etc.? Whatever you think. Give me whatever you think, and I will go from that. Okay. All right.